Los Angeles was the dream factory where ambition kissed possibility under perpetual sunshine and palm trees swayed promises of reinvention. But today, the locals whisper warnings that newcomers never hear, dark territorial truths that transform the golden dream into something far more complex. And if you've ever imagined moving to the City of Angels or already lived here without understanding what truly operates beneath the surface of Hollywood glamour, I guarantee that after the next few minutes, you will never see Los Angeles the same way again. What happened to the dream we all imagined? Why do the residents who built their lives in this sprawling metropolis now warn their children about entire neighborhoods that once represented hope? The answer lies buried under layers of Instagram filters and celebrity sightings, beneath the illusion of endless opportunity that the entertainment industry projects globally. But the territorial reality that locals know tells a radically different story. A story that begins with the most dramatic transformation any American city has experienced in the span of just a few generations. Less than a century and a half ago, Los Angeles was barely more than a dusty pueblo of adobe buildings clustered around a modest plaza, home to perhaps 15,000 souls, living in what was essentially an agricultural outpost, where orange groves stretched as far as eyes could see, and the air smelled of citrus blossoms rather than smog. The elderly descendants of those founding families, the ones whose ancestors arrived before Hollywood was even conceived, still remember stories passed down about when you could see the San Gabriel Mountains crystalline and sharp every single day, when the Los Angeles River actually flowed with water year-round and children swam in its channels without fear, when the land felt spacious and forgiving rather than crowded and hostile. That was the real Los Angeles. The Los Angeles that existed before railroad barons and real estate speculators decided that this Mediterranean climate could be marketed as paradise and sold to the highest bidders. And what came next was a transformation so rapid and so total that even today, over 100 years later, the city still reels from effects that the tourism and entertainment industries prefer to keep carefully hidden from public view. The first territorial warning that locals repeat constantly relates to something that defines Los Angeles more than anything else yet remains invisible to most who move here: the water, or rather the complete absence of natural water to support a metropolis of nearly 4 million people in what is essentially a semi-arid desert. Residents who've studied the history, especially environmental activists and water rights advocates, know something that transplants rarely consider. Los Angeles stole its water, literally appropriated it through political manipulation and outright deception from communities hundreds of miles away, draining the Owens Valley so completely that it transformed from fertile farmland into a dust bowl, destroying Mono Lake's ecosystem, and diverting the Colorado River to such an extent that it no longer reaches the ocean. The engineers who maintain the city's water infrastructure understand the precariousness of this system, the fact that Los Angeles exists only because of the most ambitious and, some would say, arrogant water theft in American history, and that every drop flowing from taps in Beverly Hills or Santa Monica traveled through aqueducts stretching across deserts and mountains in defiance of natural hydrology. The farmers whose land was seized through eminent domain in the early 1900s, their descendants still remember and still resent, telling stories of how Los Angeles agents misrepresented their intentions and systematically bought up water rights until entire communities collapsed from drought while the city flourished obscenely. Today's residents mostly remain oblivious to this history, turning on showers and filling pools without understanding that their comfort depends on a system that devastated other regions, a territorial warning that speaks to the fundamental unsustainability of building massive cities where nature never intended them to exist. The second territorial alert emerges from the invisible borders that crisscross Los Angeles in patterns that maps never show, but that residents understand with deadly seriousness. While tourists photograph Hollywood stars embedded in sidewalks and influencers pose at trendy cafes in Silver Lake, the city operates under a complex system of gang territories that have remained remarkably stable for decades, invisible lines that divide neighborhoods more effectively than any wall. Longtime residents, especially those who grew up in South LA, Compton, or East LA, possess intimate knowledge of these boundaries, can tell you exactly which street marks the edge of which set's territory, understand which colors to avoid wearing in which neighborhoods, know instinctively which shortcuts to never take, even if GPS suggests them. The paramedics and emergency room doctors who work in these areas see the consequences nightly, treating gunshot wounds from territorial disputes that stretch back generations, conflicts so ingrained that even young children understand the geography of danger surrounding their homes. Teachers in schools that sit on border zones implement protocols that seem insane to outsiders but make perfect sense locally, like keeping students inside during certain hours when rival schools dismiss, understanding that the walk home traverses multiple territories where the wrong affiliation can mean violence. The territorial warning here cuts deep. Los Angeles contains multiple cities within the city, zones operating under different rules where the social contract breaks down, and survival depends on understanding codes that are never written but always enforced. Mothers who clean mansions in Brentwood during the day return to neighborhoods where they've trained their children to hit the floor at the sound of certain noises, where helicopters hovering overhead are so routine that locals barely notice them anymore, where the gap between the LA of postcards and the LA of daily survival is so vast it feels like different countries existing in the same geographic space. The third territorial warning relates to something that defines existence in Los Angeles more than almost any other factor: the traffic. But not just the inconvenience of congestion that everyone jokes about, rather the fundamental hostility of a city designed entirely around automobiles at the expense of human scale and livability. Urban planners who study Los Angeles recognize it as perhaps the ultimate cautionary tale of car-centric development. A sprawling metropolis where public transportation was deliberately destroyed by automobile and oil interests in one of the most successful corporate conspiracies in American history. The Pacific Electric Railway once connected the entire region with over 1,000 miles of efficient streetcar lines, but General Motors, Standard Oil, and Firestone systematically bought and dismantled the system, replacing trains with buses and ultimately creating automodal dependency so complete that not owning a car in Los Angeles functionally means economic exclusion. Residents without vehicles face nightmarish commutes of multiple hours on inadequate bus systems to reach jobs just miles away, trapped in a city that sprawls across nearly 500 square miles with no practical way to navigate it. The environmental cost is catastrophic, with Los Angeles sitting in a natural bowl surrounded by mountains that trap emissions, creating smog so severe that in the 1970s, the air quality was literally hazardous. Children playing outside suffered lung damage, and even today, despite improvements, the city regularly violates federal air quality standards. The territorial warning embedded here speaks to how Los Angeles sacrificed community, environment, and human connection on the altar of automotive individualism, creating a city where people spend years of their lives trapped in cars, where road rage is endemic because the stress of navigating this hostile infrastructure corrodes mental health, where the simple act of getting anywhere becomes an ordeal that structures and limits every aspect of existence. The fourth alert that veteran residents repeat with growing urgency concerns the systematic displacement and gentrification that has transformed Los Angeles neighborhoods so rapidly that longtime communities barely recognize places their families inhabited for generations. The descendants of families who built Boyle Heights, who created vibrant Chicano culture in East LA, who established thriving Black communities in South Central and Leimert Park, now watches skyrocketing property values and aggressive development push them to peripheries, replacing cultural institutions with artisanal coffee shops and boutiques that serve newcomers with money while ignoring residents who've lived there for decades. The artists and activists fighting gentrification document systematic patterns, how developers specifically target neighborhoods with good bones and poor residents, how city policies incentivize luxury development over affordable housing, how entire cultural landscapes disappear as rents triple in just a few years. The elderly residents who've lived in the same rent-controlled apartments for 40 or 50 years know they're the last holdouts, that when they die or are forced out, their units will be renovated and rented for 5 times the price to tech workers or entertainment industry transplants who have no connection to the neighborhood's history. The street vendors who've served their communities for generations suddenly face aggressive enforcement of permit regulations that were ignored for decades, targeted specifically as neighborhoods become valuable to wealthier demographics who view their presence as blight rather than culture. Musicians and cultural practitioners watch as venues that nurtured LA's incredible musical diversity close one by one, replaced by developments that offer nothing to the communities they displace. The territorial warning here is about erasure, about how Los Angeles consumes and discards its own cultural soul in pursuit of real estate profits, about how the city's diversity and creativity, the very things that made it vital, are being systematically eliminated by market forces that reduce neighborhoods to investment opportunities rather than homes. The fifth territorial warning emerges from the ground itself, from geological realities that locals understand but that newcomers often ignore until it's too late. Los Angeles sits on some of the most seismically active land in North America, laced with fault lines that guarantee devastating earthquakes will strike with regularity. The seismologists who study the region explain that the San Andreas Fault, capable of producing magnitude 8 or higher quakes, runs directly through the area, and that Los Angeles is overdue for the big one that will cause catastrophic damage across the entire metropolitan region. The structural engineers who inspect buildings understand which structures will collapse when major shaking occurs, can identify the thousands of older brick buildings and soft-story apartments that were never retrofitted to modern seismic standards, and know that affordable housing stock tends to be concentrated in the most vulnerable structures, meaning the poorest residents face the greatest risk. Longtime residents remember the Northridge earthquake in 1994. How in just seconds, freeways collapsed, buildings pancaked, and 60 people died. How the city took years to fully recover. And that was only a magnitude 6.7 event, nowhere near the worst-case scenario that experts say is inevitable. The emergency management officials tasked with disaster preparedness speak privately about how a truly major earthquake would overwhelm response capacity, how the city has only enough water and supplies stockpiled for a fraction of the population, how mass casualties and social breakdown are likely outcomes that planning can mitigate but not prevent. The territorial warning embedded in this geological reality is that Los Angeles exists in defiance of nature, built in a location that periodically reminds inhabitants of human fragility through violent earth movements, and that the density of development and the inadequacy of infrastructure mean that when the inevitable occurs, the consequences will be devastating, particularly for those who can least afford to rebuild or relocate. The sixth territorial alert that locals share in quiet conversations relates to something the entertainment industry works tirelessly to obscure: the exploitation and predatory behavior that permeate Hollywood and the broader entertainment ecosystem in ways that corrupt the entire culture of Los Angeles. The workers who keep the industry functioning, the production assistants and crew members and assistants, witness and experience abuse so normalized it becomes invisible. From wage theft and impossible hours to sexual harassment and assault that victims rarely report, because speaking up means career death in an industry where reputation and connections determine employment. The young people who arrive in Los Angeles with dreams of making it in entertainment discover a brutal reality of exploitation, where unpaid internships and poverty wages are positioned as necessary dues paying, where power imbalances enable predators to operate openly, where the promise of opportunity is weaponized to extract labor and sometimes bodies without fair compensation. The talent agencies and production companies have human resources departments that exist primarily to protect the company rather than employees, sophisticated legal apparatuses designed to silence complaints and intimidate victims into accepting settlements with non-disclosure agreements that allow abuse to continue unchecked. The casting directors and producers can point to specific individuals known throughout the industry as predators, missing stare everyone routes around, but who continue working because they have power or make money for the right people. Aspiring actors and models face particular vulnerability, attending auditions in hotel rooms and private residences, pressured to accept uncomfortable situations, because rejecting advances might mean losing opportunities in a viciously competitive field where thousands compete for every role. The territorial warning here speaks to how Los Angeles' dream factory operates partly as a systematic exploitation machine, how the glamour projected globally obscures machinery that chews up vulnerable people and spits them out, how the city's entire social structure reflects entertainment industry hierarchies where your worth is determined by your proximity to success and power rather than inherent human dignity. The seventh territorial warning concerns the homeless crisis that has exploded across Los Angeles to such an extent that it represents humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in real time in one of the wealthiest cities in the wealthiest nation on Earth. The social workers and outreach coordinators who work directly with unhoused populations understand numbers that shock even residents who've lived here for years. Over 65,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night, sprawling encampments under freeway overpasses and along riverbeds and on sidewalks throughout the city. Visible human suffering that has become so ubiquitous it risks normalizing something that should horrify conscience. The formerly homeless individuals who managed to secure housing described the impossibility of escaping the streets in a city where even studio apartments rent for $1,500 or $2,000 monthly, where a single financial emergency can cascade into eviction, where once you're on the streets, the barriers to getting back into housing become nearly insurmountable. The public health officials document disease outbreaks and mortality rates among homeless populations that resemble conditions in developing nations, tuberculosis and hepatitis spreading in encampments lacking basic sanitation, deaths from exposure during rare cold snaps, overdoses from fentanyl-laced drugs that tear through vulnerable populations. The housed residents struggle with compassion fatigue, caught between empathy for human suffering and frustration at the visible disorder, at tents blocking sidewalks and making neighborhoods feel unsafe, at a problem so massive and intractable that individual charity feels meaningless. The city government spends billions on homelessness, yet the problem grows worse, money disappearing into administrative overhead and ineffective programs while people continue dying on the streets. The territorial warning here is about societal failure, about how Los Angeles allowed a housing affordability crisis to metastasize into humanitarian disaster, about how a city that projects images of wealth and success contains thousands living in third-world conditions, about what it means that we've collectively accepted this as normal. The eighth territorial alert that long-term residents emphasize with increasing alarm concerns the water scarcity and climate impacts that threaten Los Angeles' very viability as drought intensifies and the Colorado River dwindles toward levels that cannot support current population. The climatologists who study regional impacts of global warming project futures where water becomes so scarce that difficult choices about which communities get cut off become inevitable, where the lush lawns and swimming pools that characterize wealthy neighborhoods become impossible luxuries, where the entire Southwest faces potential mass migration as resources fail. The water managers who operate the complex systems supplying Los Angeles explain that the city uses far more water than sustainable sources provide, depending on groundwater overdraft and imports that grow less reliable each year as upstream states face their own shortages and legal agreements get renegotiated. The residents who remember earlier droughts, particularly the severe shortage in the late 70s when lawns died and restaurants stopped serving water automatically, understand that those conditions could become permanent rather than temporary, that Los Angeles might face managed decline rather than continued growth. The farmers in the Central Valley, whose water supplies get diverted to urban uses, resent deeply the inequity of sacrificing agriculture to maintain landscaping in cities, political tensions that could fracture into serious conflicts as scarcity worsens. The insurance companies quietly raising rates and declining to cover properties in wildfire zones understand risks that many homeowners ignore, that climate change makes the hills surrounding Los Angeles increasingly uninhabitable as fires grow more frequent and severe. The territorial warning embedded here speaks to fundamental unsustainability, to the reality that Los Angeles was built on assumptions about resource availability that no longer hold true, and that without radical transformation in how the city uses water and energy, the dream might simply run dry. The ninth and perhaps most disturbing territorial warning that locals whisper with mixture of resignation and deep anger relates to the two-tier society that Los Angeles has become, a place where inequality is so extreme and so visible that it corrodes any sense of shared community or social solidarity. The workers who serve the wealthy in their hillside mansions, cleaning homes and maintaining landscapes and caring for children, witness wealth so obscene it becomes surreal. Closets larger than their apartments, cars worth more than they'll earn in a lifetime, casual spending on luxury goods that could pay their rent for a year. The teachers in public schools watch as wealthy families abandon the system entirely for private schools, as funding erodes and resources disappear, while just miles away, elite institutions offer educational experiences that seem from different planets. The doctors in public hospitals treat uninsured patients with conditions that would be easily managed with preventive care, watching people suffer from poverty diseases in a city where wealth concentrates at levels rivaling any place on Earth. The elderly residents on fixed incomes understand that they're being priced out systematically, that property tax protections under Proposition 13 are all that keeps them housed, that Los Angeles increasingly belongs only to the very wealthy or the very desperate, with disappearing middle ground. The young people born and raised in LA realize that they cannot afford to live in their hometown, that the city where they grew up has become inaccessible, that unless they achieve extraordinary success, they face permanent exile or poverty living on margins. The territorial warning here cuts to the core of what Los Angeles has become, a place where success is measured purely in wealth, where human worth correlates directly with economic productivity, where the social fabric has frayed so completely that homelessness and hunger exist blocks from excess so grotesque it would have embarrassed previous generations, where we've accepted as normal a level of inequality that makes genuine democracy nearly impossible. These 9 territorial warnings that Los Angeles locals continue repeating paint a composite portrait of a city that lost its soul chasing dreams that served some while excluding many. A place where surface beauty and glamour conceal layers of deeply rooted problems that grow more severe with each passing year. Long-term residents look around their transformed city and barely recognize what it has become. Walk through neighborhoods where they once knew every face and now see only transient populations cycling through. Newcomers who arrived yesterday and will leave tomorrow. Tourists who stay a week and never understand where they truly are. The melancholy is palpable in conversations among those who remember, who maintain faded photographs of empty beaches and clear skies, who tell incredulous younger generations about a time when Los Angeles meant something different than it means now. But perhaps the deepest warning, the one encompassing all others, is this. Los Angeles represents not just its own tragedy, but a model that replicates across America, across the world, wherever capitalism develops territory without regard for community or sustainability. It's an experiment in how much a place can transform before losing completely its essence, in how much pressure ecosystems can bear before collapsing irreversibly, in how much inequality society can tolerate before tensions erupt in ways no police force can contain. The locals who warn do so not from malice, but from exhaustion, from witnessing too many broken promises, too many dreams turn nightmares, too many generations sacrificed to a version of progress that enriches few while degrading home for many. The palm trees still sway in warm breezes. The beaches still attract millions annually. Hollywood still projects images of glamour and success globally. And the marketing machinery continues promoting LA as the place where dreams come true. But now you know what the locals know. You've heard warnings they share only among themselves. You've glimpsed shadows inhabiting spaces behind the professional smiles and cheerful facades. Los Angeles remains beautiful on its surface, that's undeniable, but its beauty built on increasingly fragile foundations, an illusion maintained through monumental effort by thousands of invisible workers who know intimately the real cost of keeping the dream machine functioning. Perhaps you'll still choose to move here, and that's okay. Migration isn't inherently wrong, and the city provides livelihoods for millions. But if you come with open eyes, come understanding a complete story, come respecting that you're entering territory that meant something to communities long before anyone dreamed of movie studios and tech startups. Tip generously those who serve you, because their realities are harsher than you imagine. Ask where your food comes from, how your water arrives, what happened to ecosystems you occupy temporarily. Listen when locals speak, truly listen, because their warnings aren't complaints, but lessons about what happens when we forget that paradise isn't infinite, when we assume beauty can be exploited indefinitely without consequences, when we prioritize convenience of our experience over sustainability of their home. The territorial warnings continue, repeated in Spanish that transplants don't speak, in looks that newcomers don't see, in conversations happening after the last tourists retreat to their hotels. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people begin hearing these warnings, if enough voices demand better, there could be hope that Los Angeles finds a path towards something more sustainable, more just, more like the dream it promised to be, rather than the complicated mirage it has become. But that would require everyone, locals and newcomers, developers and activists, government and industry, to acknowledge honestly what's been lost and work genuinely to protect what remains before it's too late. If this look behind the curtain impacted you, if these 9 territorial warnings changed your perspective on cities we think we know, share this knowledge with others planning to move here. And if you want to understand more about how ambition and capitalism transform places and people, about stories that Chamber of Commerce never tells, subscribe, because the next destination we explore might reveal truths even more disturbing about the dreams we believe we're chasing.